doesn't dry up it like that.
Yeah.
Thinking that what I just said is ridiculous. Surely being the son of the fourth Hokage and a particularly blessed member of the Uzumaki clan means Naruto should be predisposed to being a good ninja, right? No, that's not how that works. If you're good at something, your kid isn't going to be automatically good at that thing. Sometimes that sort of thing happens. Some famous singers are the children of other famous singers.
But I never
but it's
said
not
that
so
you
common.
automatically. Like, I made that clear.
That's fine. I was saying thank you to Swag in general, not in a diss to you, but
yeah, but like, it doesn't make sense for you to say that.
Well, I think the basketball example is the easiest one. Is that you could be a famous basketball player who's the best in the world at basketball. Your kid's probably not going to be good at basketball. It's like most likely not going to be good at basketball. I'll even add. At least in terms of talent.
Say that again.
If you are the world's best basketball player and you have a child, your child is most likely not going to be exceptional at basketball.
Okay, that's not true. You could say most likely not necessarily as good as you, but exceptional. No, there's probably a good chance he could be if he wants to do it anyway.
Well, yeah, anyone could be if they wanted to. When I'm saying exceptional, I am talking about like near the top. Because anyone could be good. I'm talking about exceptional. Like, you don't have to be best in the world, but like NBA. Not everyone can be an NBA player.
Yeah, but like, you definitely have a higher chance if you're the son of, like, LeBron James's kid is going to have a higher chance than your kid.
So are you saying that because like genetics such as tallness would be a factor? Or is it also in reference to, again, the nurture? Because I wouldn't be considering either of those. I'm talking about purely the skill / talent.
It is with a decent chance. Well, I mean, I don't know. Like in LeBron's case, Steph Curry is probably a better example for this. He might have motor skills that in jazz of that nature that assists in his ability to be good at shooting, on top of obviously his practice and all that jazz. But like, yeah, so there's a chance. I mean, I don't know specifically. I'm not an expert on basketball motor skills by any means.
Yeah. Well, I mean, regardless of this basketball specifically, and again, we don't have to stay on this one for long, so we already talked about it, is the heatedest debate of this podcast anyways, is at the very least, it changes over time. When you're like a 5-year-old, your reaction speed's going to be worse than when you're a 15-year-old, which is going to be better than when you're a 55-year-old, etc., etc.
But that's independent of, like, from person to person, like, two different people, they're going to follow that same trend. But in person A, they'll just always be higher than person B at all times, more than likely.
That's definitely not
outside of
the
like
case.
obvious training factors that can influence it.
No, I would say the age of the individual matters way more than any genetics ever could.
Not necessarily. Like, some people, for example, using testosterone, like at like 30.
That is okay. We're not using testosterone as an example right now, Kamui.
Yes, I am. Okay, because there are 50-year-olds when their testosterone is going to be pretty low relative to the life.
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant like injecting testosterone. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not referring to that. I'm talking about naturally.
Yeah, go ahead.
Naturally, there's going to be a 50-year-old who's already lost, like, their testosterone's gone downhill for 20 years. He's still going to have more testosterone than some 18-year-olds. That exists out there. Either because his is really high, the old guy, or because the other one's is really low, the young guy.
That's not what I was getting at. I was directly responding in your one-to-one comparison that one person will always be better than the other person at this same age based on their genetics. If you are better than me...
there's going to be some people that at all ages he's better. Like, so.
Well, yeah, some people. But like Kamui, if you're better than me at hand-eye coordination at age 20, but then I'm better than you at 60, that would just break this whole idea.
Yeah, but like outside of training factors, that's not going to be likely unless there's like a genetic disposition for you to deteriorate at an earlier age, which can happen, of course.
But that's my
That's also
point,
genetic.
is that it's, regardless of the genetics of talent,
that's not about the age.
if you want to
that's
say
more
it's
about
the genetics of
and
the
then the age
age,
is
I would just say
secondary
the
factor.
age is a much, much, much bigger factor than the genetics of the talent.
But in that case, though, it's because of the genetics that this is happening in the first place.
I would say it's because of the age, but sure, if you want to say that. Either way, it's not because of the genetics of the talent, so it doesn't matter because that was the argument that you were having there.
I didn't really hear what you said, to be honest.
Okay, whatever.
Common that we can say it's a guarantee. And usually this happens as a result of the child receiving some kind of help or instruction from the parent in question, which Naruto obviously didn't. If they'd actually survived and had taught Naruto the same way other ninja have been shown instructing their children, then we could talk about privilege as far as this is concerned. But
one more thing is that I'll also point out that, again, regardless of like genetics in terms of like height or something, if you can run fast for your height, that something like that isn't necessarily going to pass on to your child, because again, like fast twitch muscles, you got to develop that. You could argue that, oh, it develops easier, but then that's your genetics in terms of how your muscle development growth would be rather than your talent at running.
Right?
It'd be like your form or whatever. That would be the argument there. But that's not really the point I was making here. I think the speed would be interesting. But the real comparison I'm making is the different range in this factor at all. Speed would be one. Like, you might run like half a mile faster than me. Like half a mile per hour faster than me, I should clarify, since that's a speed measurement. But the reaction one would be way, way better, to where the reaction speed range margin bell curve is probably so minutely different that it's almost unrecognizable. Like, let's just say the 25 to 75% threshold is like 0.5. It's probably less than that. It's probably like 0.3 seconds of their reaction, which playing that in real time
but
is
it all
so
depends on
unbelievable.
the sport, though, because in the context, because in some sports, let's just say ping pong, that reaction time of 0.3 seconds or whatever means a lot more than it's likely going to mean in another sport. I would just say, I don't know what sport would be the least important for this. Track and field. Or actually, I'll use track and field. In the 60-meter dash, your reaction time to the start gun matters infinitely more than it does in the 10K. That 0.3 seconds doesn't matter.
Yeah,
but the 0.3 seconds is visually even a big difference in a 60-meter dash.
I completely 100% agree with you. So that's just the end of that. I agree with you on that. That is a separate thing from what I was getting at. So what I was saying is that the minute difference, and this is where I agree with you, it matters in comparison to like one another on that minute scale. So if your reaction speed is 0.03 seconds and mine is 0.06 seconds, then you have like double my reaction speed. But on the grand scale, realistically, we're about the same, because in real time, that's such a minute difference, despite being literally double, that it doesn't actually play a perceivable effect in real life, regardless of like high motor speed sports.
Yeah,
or
but
whatever.
we're talking about sports-specific comparisons where this would matter.
Well, but our
it
genetics
doesn't matter in terms of your daily life going to the store or whatever, but it would matter in a competition in which that reaction time is beneficial.
Beneficial, yes, but beneficial to the output, the sport. It's our genetics aren't made for our sports. It's made for our reaction speed / skills, which benefit our sports. And in general, all of our skills are so relative to one another that it effectively doesn't matter in terms of how genetics, why genetics would be better or worse in this regard. It's not like evolution
Well,
is
no,
like
because-
bottlenecking out certain like percent thresholds below or whatever.
What?
Because that's
If-
how the genetics would play a factor in the first place.
What? Say that again.
Our genetics are good to help us survive, not to play sports.
Yeah.
And so it's not to be good at basketball. It's to have as good eye motor contact function, whatever, as possible.
The point, Oodie. Okay, Oodie. I never said that. I feel like I guess it wasn't clear. The point is that those. So let's just use reaction time again. If your dad has 0.0, he's got insanely good reaction times, and the mom also does too. They're both the Guinness Book of World Records reaction time. They're more than likely going to pass along better reaction times to their child as someone on the other end of the spectrum with terrible reaction, the slowest reaction speeds of all time. Now, is that basketball talent specifically? No. Like I said, the point is that these various, in this case, reaction times can therefore lend itself to that person being more successful in basketball if that's what they choose to pursue, of course. So I used just motor control in their hands for dribbling was my example earlier. But like, that's the point, is that Steph Curry might just have really good hand motor control. His kid has a greater chance of inheriting really good hand motor control. Maybe he's going to use that for, I don't know, to be really good at whack-a-mole instead of basketball. Maybe he will play basketball. The point is has a better predisposition to be good at anything that involves really good hand motor control because of his genetics in that sense, assuming he inherits it. He could not inherit it. It's possible, but he has a greater chance of inheriting it. That is all.
Well, outside of me just disagreeing with that, which doesn't matter for this in general, I would say that even if that is the case, if you're working with 0.01 reaction speed versus 0.02 reaction speed, well, both people at the high end and the low end of that scale both have a fraction of a second. It's realistically not going to play a difference in terms of like genetics.
It depends on the sport. Like
it's not about the sport. It takes sports out of it entirely. The variation in the genetics are going to be so minute that the minute difference in the genetics compared to the minute reaction speed would be indecipherable. It would come down to the other factors, which are infinitely more important, assuming genetics is important.
But you're specifying, I mean, this would apply to all things. Like, obviously, Steph Curry doesn't have just one specific gene that he excels in. He's got all sorts of them. He's probably got 20 that he just so happens to have a high amount of in this case. Whether it's things that help him run faster, things that help him jump higher, things that help him react to change direction better, the hand motor skills, all that jazz. He's got all of those things working for him in this case, and they all add up to something that matters.
It's working with low numbers on such a minimal threshold that they're indistinguishable from one another. Similarly, if we did the opposite, let's just say hypothetically. Let's just say hypothetically.
They're not indistinguishable from one another.
They are realistically, but let's just say hypothetically, we're working on the opposite end with big numbers.
No, they aren't in terms of regular daily life. Going to the store, it doesn't matter.
Let me make
but
my
in
example,
the context of the sport, it does matter.
I already said I'm away from the sports.
In the first place.
I'm away from the sports. The sports are not a part of the conversation.
Why are you going away from the sport? Because my entire thing is about the sport example.
Because it's about the motor skill,
the attractiveness
which helps in the sport.
Yeah.
The motor skill is relative to one another.
The motor skill's going to pass down regardless.
The motor skill is so minutely different, but that minute difference makes a big difference in some sports.
Yeah.
But all motor skills are about the same to one another. again, getting to the example that I wanted to make, going with the big numbers on the other end of this, if you could run 1,000,000 miles based on your genetics, and I could run 1,000,005 miles, you and I are practically the same. If that's the high end and the low end. Yes, it would matter in a sport, but physically, we would be essentially the same to the point that genetics wouldn't be the factor between that 5-mile difference. It would undoubtedly be any of the other far more important factors.
No, what you're saying doesn't make sense. Like, you started the premise admitting that our genetics is why we have that difference. It still is the reason. It doesn't just disappear. You started the premise. If it's because of our genetics that I can do 1,000,005 versus you doing 1,000,000, and it matters in that sport. It doesn't matter in real life, obviously, but we have kids. Let's just say our kids inherit the same genes. That my kid's just gonna win in this regard again because of genetics. Because that was the start of the premise.
You're thinking of it too simply.
Because of the genetics. It's not just gonna disappear.
There's no, those genetics don't exist. Genetics to run 1,000,005 miles don't
then you
exist.
can't have.
It would be,
and now your thing doesn't work then.
use common
So you're
sense
just
and
saying
it does
it's not
work.
because
It's
of
not
genetics.
about the miles. I'm applying that to the output of the sport. It would be obviously in regards to the input. Our genetics of our leg calf muscles would be indistinguishable from one another.
But it is distinguishable in the sport.
The sport doesn't matter.
But the sport matters because we're gonna pass down those genes regardless, meaning my kid will still, assuming everything else is equal in terms of training stuff, would still win. For the same reason.
The genetic gives you the range. Because of the genetic of the leg, calf, muscle, whatever, dexterity, I don't care, stamina, your children will have the ability to run between the range of 1,000,000 to 1,000,005 miles. It's undoubtedly 99% the factors
That's not how
of
that
their
works
life
in the first place.
that actually determine where within that 5-mile range they will be able to run.
This thing you're saying isn't how it works in the first place. It's not that you don't, the genetics put you in this range. No, that's not what it does. It's just, you just have a, whatever, like, you just are more explosive. You're able to improve in this field more than someone else, and so, all these different factors like that. It's, you're not, this range thing doesn't exist.
So little to the degree that it's not about the genetics, it's about the other factors, because the genetics are, if they exist at all, then they are the least common denominator in terms of variance. But whatever.
No, because the problem is we're asking a question of, I'm not saying that genetics are more important than actually practicing basketball. That's not what I'm saying. The question is, do these skills that, like, if Steph Curry has these motor skills, blah, 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 that he's just born being good at, will they pass down to his kids? Well, more than likely, yes. And because of that, is that kid going to be predisposed to have the potential to be very good at basketball? The answer is yes. He has to obviously do all the practice, which is obviously more important than just having the motor skills. If he doesn't practice basketball, he's still going to suck at basketball. No matter how good his motor skills are, he's just not going to have the basketball skills. He didn't do it. But the point is that those genes pass down, and they do help if he pursues basketball. So yes, in that regard, you can inherit traits that predispose you to be better at a sport. In this case, basketball.
I wouldn't qualify traits as genetics, but more as like physical differences such as type. But that's not the point. Anyways, what I'm trying to get at, the genetics aren't a singular set value. Your genetic isn't saying your motor function is 0.03 seconds. It is saying you either are good or bad within a range based on your genetic. But then that can alter
in some cases genetics could be
throughout your life.
to where Yeah, like I understand what you're saying there, but like there's also like your rate of growth, your ability to grow. You might start at a low end, but your genetics allow you to grow to a higher end in the long run if you actually do the thing that puts you there. But
Being hyperbolic,
none of this matters to my initial thing I said, though.
being hyperbolic with my example, if Steph Curry, let's just say hypothetically, Steph Curry does have the worst basketball genetics in the world. The world. He's at the low end of the spectrum. That essentially doesn't matter because it's all the other factors that add up that make the actual difference. He's technically from birth the least likely to be good, but that probability based on genetics is practically zero because the probability of being good at basketball isn't in the genetics, it's in all the other factors because everyone's genetics, despite being different, are essentially the same.
That would be true, but sorry to break it, that isn't reality.
In comparison to the ratio of the other variables.
See, again, you're arguing the ratio of variable, but none of that matters to what I said to begin with. The question was, can these traits be inherited? The answer is yes. That doesn't mean it's the most important thing. Never did I claim that. All I'm saying is yes, there are some traits as it pertains to these skills that can be inherited. The answer is yes. Can they help you in the sport? The answer is yes.
This whole argument wasn't saying no. It's saying if it is yes, then even in this case, of which I disagree with in the first place, but even entertaining it, it doesn't matter in a way that is noticeable.
So first of all, you just admitted yourself that you think no. So yes, you have been. The argument has been yes versus no.
Not in this conversation in regards to this. Matter. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to have this conversation.
I didn't say it matters the most. I said that it matters more than you're letting on. That's how this started.
Name a factor that would matter less than genetics.
More than you're acting like. You're acting like it matters 0.1%, but I think it's going to be at least 10%.
Okay, name a factor that matters less than genetics.
In what?
In terms of being good at basketball.
Yeah, where you go to school.
I would say that definitely matters more than genetics.
Okay, what town you live in?
Okay, a factor that is like internal rather than something that doesn't make sense.
Well, what would be internal that isn't genetics?
Kamui, I mean, like a factor that's actually affecting you.
Whether you like basketball in the first place,
like
that matters more than genetics. So.
Yeah, Kamui, if we're gonna play that game, then the type of toothbrush I use matters less in my basketball skill than genetics. The sock I put on my left foot matters less at my basketball skill than genetics. But that's not about me. That's influencing my performance, but that's not changing me.
But you asked for internal. You want external.
The school is a better one rather than town because that is more about nurture. The town can be that too, a poor town versus a rich town, which in that case, it wouldn't be about the town. It would be about the lifestyle/cultural differences where one may play basketball or have more privilege or have more tools or assets or resources at their disposition than the other. It wouldn't be about the town.
Yeah.
So I'm talking about that's just
your entire life environment.
Yeah, so the town is the indirect factor, which leads to the direct factor. I'm talking about a direct factor.
But then you're going to get to, there's going to be a bunch of goofy stuff. Like, what you want me to say.
I mean, you're saying that it's not the least important. I'm saying that it is. So there has to be a
No, I'm
factor
not
that you're
even saying
considering.
that. I'm not even saying it's not the least important. I'm saying that it's more important than you're letting on. So what does that mean in terms of numbers? You're acting like it's 0.01% important. I'm saying let's single out 5 things or whatever. It might be 10% genetics and then 30% something else. Let's just say, I don't know, the fact that your school has a really good basketball coach, and then 20% for the other 3 factors. 10% still the least important, but that's 10%, not 0.01%.
Okay. So
That's
then,
what I'm getting at.
for the sake of this argument, which I don't believe in the first place, it can be 10%, it could be 0.01% regardless. Do you think it is the least important of all of the direct factors?
I don't know, because I would need a list of all the direct factors, and I can't come up with them off the top of my head.
That's completely fine. We can move on. By the way, that is 6 hours.
The main point is,
Yeah.
I think it matters, and it is noticeable.
Oh, well, noticeable, I would say.
Might not be the most noticeable, it might not be the most important, but I think it makes a significant enough degree to matter.
Not compared
Whereas
to the
you
other
think it
direct
doesn't.
variables, but either
It
way.
doesn't matter compared to them. The point is that it matters in general, which is all I've been arguing.
If you can't notice it, then I would argue it doesn't matter. But it's
But you
immeasurable.
can notice it, is what I'm saying. It is noticeable.
It would have to be measurable in a way that like makes statistical,
It is measurable.
observational
Run a race.
differences. Run a race? My race isn't determined by my genetics. It's determined by everything else I've done in my life. In terms of
and
my
that's the reason
talent.
why there are some people. Okay, I'll give you examples, Oodie. There are kids who I ran track with who didn't do jack shit, didn't show up or anything, and they were blatantly better than the hardest working kid on the team.
Yeah.
What's your explanation, Oodie? Is it not the fact that he just is naturally better at it?
Better at what specifically?
Running fast.
They're tall. Of course.
No. Wasn't even taller. Same height.
Okay, it doesn't matter about the amount of effort you put in. It's practice makes permanent, not perfect. Naruto put in the most effort of anyone. So did Lee. Naruto and Lee weren't at the top of the top either.
Did you say practice makes perfect when I gave an example of someone who didn't go to practice?
I said practice makes permanent, not perfect.
Oh,
and then
permanent.
I listed Lee and Naruto as examples.
Yeah, I was confused. Regardless, I'm just being honest. The kid I have in mind was objectively a higher body fat. The faster kid was a higher body fat. Didn't try ever. Wasn't even there all the time. The other kid put in way more work. Is lighter. and no, and I'm not talking about sprinting, by the way. This is distance running. And he's just still not as good. I'm another example. I untrained before I ever started doing track, was just straight up beating. I just joined in a cross country race. My dad was coaching, and I was beating most of the team. Never run a distance, just beat them.
Well, Kamui, I'm not going to say this is the case, as unlikely as it would be, is that this would just be taking all these real people as the hypothetical versions that you see them as. How do you know they are or aren't training when you aren't seeing them?
Well, I know for a fact of one of my friends because I saw him. I grew up with him. I did sports with him. I saw him running on the road way more than I ever did for track. He worked hard. I did. Well, once I started doing track, I was a very hard worker, but
fair enough.
I worked too hard. I overtrained, but that's besides the point.
I get that.
I was likely. I still am. I still run into that problem.
But either way, again, assuming genetics plays a factor at all, you could call this unreasonable. I wouldn't say genetics. If there's anything else in the world that it could be, some things just click better. Some people have a natural affinity, and that's not just genetics. That's just some brains working better than others in some regards, because not all brains are the same or work the same. Well, people have different types of brains.
Yeah, but here's what you need to understand. But here's what you need to understand. Just because we say genetics, you need to understand this. You can be born a certain way, and you, like I say, brains just work differently. That is genetic. It doesn't mean it's directly inherited from your parents, because you can have the gene splice do all their magic, and it ends up with something different. That's why and that can happen. And your brain is still unique in that case. It just happens to click for you that it is still genetic. It doesn't have to directly come from your parents or grandparents, whatever. The point is, it's still your DNA. It's still genetics.
See, AI would
is the
disagree
point.
with you
Not
based on the
getting it.
generations of how it's trained. It's random chance leads to the path of least resistance. And so whatever is just best works
That's
for
still
someone, the
genetics.
natural affinity,
That's the
not
problem.
genetics.
It's still genetics.
If you start with a
It
blank
is,
slate,
Oodie. Argue with science. It's in your gene pool. Regardless of random chance, it's still genetics.
I mean, you're the one arguing with science, considering I listed AI as an example. You start with a blank slate, they do absolute random, and then they find the path of least resistance through their life.
Yeah, but Oodie, AI doesn't do genetics.
AI has a
Humans
neural network,
do.
which is how brains work, and that's my point. Yeah, it's not using genetics. I agree.
But it comes from, oh my god, bro. I hate arguing with Gen X about you because you just hate the G word, man. You don't get it.
I don't get it, he says, as I list AI as an example.
Exactly. You listed
Exactly.
AI as an example.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly.
You listed something that doesn't have genetics.
To make my point. Yes. About genetics that matters.
But humans have genetics. The random chance involved in genetics. It's in the name. It's genetics for your DNA. It's genetics, man.
But not everything is genetics, such as AI. And that would apply to humans.
I didn't say everything is genetic.
Okay, then some factors about humans aren't all genetics, including natural dispositions to certain things.
Well, no, that would be genetics.
Well, by natural, I mean like actually like after you do it, not like from conception.
What do you mean? Specify again? Like, what are you trying to say?
As in like generation 1 rather than like the blank slate.
Don't use AI terms. Use a real life term.
After you do anything at all to make it to where it's not just random chance and you have a path of least resistance.
You're still not doing it. I give up. Move on. Play the video.
Doing what? That wasn't AI terms. And not doing it is what you
Just
asked.
move
So if I'm
on.
still not doing it, then there you go. Like, you could be genetically left-handed, but if you picked up a pencil with your right hand first, you might not even realize that, and you might just only be naturally good at your right hand.
Well, what? No, if you are genetically left-handed, well, and unless you're trying to say you're ambidextrous, but you're not left-handed, you're both-handed.
Well, I'm just saying if you only learned from your right hand, then you wouldn't even know that you're left-handed. Like, you wouldn't even be good with your left hand. Like, just because you're left-handed doesn't mean you're automatically good with writing with your left hand if you write for your left hand for the first time in your life at like
but
50
that's
years old.
not what anyone's saying. The point is you're predisposed to be better at that. If you
But you
use them
never
equally,
were.
you'd be better at your left hand.
Yeah, so things that are natural aren't
Okay,
necessarily
that's
always going
not
to be the case.
That's not a natural predisposition. That is an artificial environmental condition you either chose or were told. Like back in the day, they were just told to use the right hand. That they just weren't supposed to use the left hand.
Exactly.
for
Told
example.
is one thing. That's external. If you just chose to do it randomly, then that is going based on random, in which case genetics is being placed lower than whatever blank slate random chance that made you choose that.
But that's not about genetics in the first place. I'm referring to the genetics in the first place. Like, we're talking about two different things. That isn't genetics.
Yes.
The fact that you just
Well, you're
whether or not
saying
you
like all
used your left
brainwave
hand isn't genetics.
activities
The
were
fact that you
genetic,
are
essentially.
left-handed is genetics.
Yes, I agree. But the fact that you chose
I don't
to
understand the
be
point.
right-hand, well, I was making the point that not everything in your brain is genetics. In this case, the choice comes from your brain. The brain wave signal activity shot through your nervous system to your
exactly.
body.
Yeah, the way your brain works is genetic. So you have one of two options. Either some sort of environmental growing up condition, you saw other kids using their right hand, that's why you chose it, meaning it's not actually random. It wouldn't be random in the first place, but because you'd be choosing it because your brain, for whatever reason, was born to want to do the right hand, even though you were born. This is basically transgender people. There you go. That you were born one gender, want to use the other gender. It would be the right and left hand in this case. Would be the scenario in that case. You were born different. That is genetic.
Well,
you were
this
born
is
that
what
way.
evolution is. It's not defined clearly going one route. It's random mutation, and the ones who are best at survival happen
That's
to
still
survive.
genetic.
And
Yeah,
the ones
I know.
who
That's
are
great.
die.
That's genetics.
What?
That's great, but that's genetics.
Yeah.
Which is my point.
So if you go back...
So you agree it's genetics.
No, you're just making random stuff up now. If you go back to before all that, to the very first amoebas, whatever, that came on the meteors to Earth, or wherever they came from there, they didn't mutate yet. They haven't breeded. There's no second generation. That's just the first life form ever. The ones that spawned from the lightning, the anaerobic ones. They're just doing random things.
Yeah. And
that's random. Not genetics.
And well, their genetics have them doing random things because they don't have consciousness and all that jazz.
Well, yeah, exactly.
But that's irrelevant to what I've been saying. There's nothing. This has nothing to do with anything.
What you've been saying is not what I've been saying. It's relevant to what I've been saying.
Which is not relevant to what I've been saying.
I'm the one that made the claim. You're just going off on your own thing. That's not my fault.
No, you're just saying. I don't understand. Like, this has nothing to do with what I initially said.
Well, I'm the one that initially said it, so.
I said that traits, like these traits were inheritable. Or you might have started by saying no, they're not, and I said they were. I think I said, oh, you can argue they are. That's how this whole thing started in Discord.
These traits specifically was talent, and then you went on to say personality, or like choice.
Well, some of those things are, yeah, because you're saying that your brain just is that way. Why is your brain born that way? Say it with me. Genetics.
You don't have realistically personality at birth, maybe like the very smallest minute detail, but like your personality as you consider someone as a human being would not be genetics.
Well, no, because for example, people that are genetically predisposed to bipolar disorder, but believe it or not, being bipolar has to do with your personality. As an example.
But that's a disorder. Again, random mutation, that's going a step beyond.
And it's genetic.
Yes.
It's an example. It's an extremity example to illustrate the point.
An extreme example.
But everyone's on a spectrum in terms of what you were born like. Now, obviously, the environment shapes you a ton, probably more than what your genetic predisposition is in that regard. I never said one was more than the other. All I said is that both are present and both matter, and that is the case.
Okay, if we're going with the idea that everyone's on a spectrum, that spectrum is measurable, and we have clearly defined lines of where quote-unquote normal would be versus like stage 1 or stage 2, etc., etc.
You do.
So there is a certain point somewhere in the stage 0 of the normalness or whatever to where it's indistinguishable. It doesn't matter from person to person. It would be other factors that are way larger in comparison to the point that you would never be able to tell the person's genetics.
But you're talking about like one specific thing in a vacuum, but you got to add up the cumulative. Like these things matter. I don't want to talk about genetics with you, bro. I hate it. It sucks. Like you don't understand certain things, and I'm sick of it.
if
I'm
you
sick
took
of the genetics.
the 1,000 best basketball players right now, and you went, let's just say they're all exactly 30 years old.
Play the video.
They're all exactly 30 years old. You go back to the day
Play
they were born.
The video.
You cannot tell
Play
their
the video
skill
on
based on their
digital.
genetics.
All right, end of stream.